Our story is that of the Battle of Megiddo, 1457 BC, the first recorded battle in history. Long before iron swords and vast empires, the world was still finding its rhythm under the blazing sun of ancient Egypt. The sands shimmered gold as Pharaoh Thutmose III, the warrior king of the 18th dynasty, prepared to march north against the rebellious Canaanite kings. It was a time when kingdoms were ruled by divine claim, and war was not merely blood and conquest but a sacred act to restore order under the will of the gods. Egypt's borders stretched wide, yet in the lands beyond the Sinai, whispers of rebellion echoed from the fortified city of Megiddo, a jewel atop the trade routes of the Near East. The Canaanite princes, led by the defiant king of Kadesh, had united dozens of city-states under one banner to challenge Egypt's dominance. They had chosen their ground wisely, fertile valleys surrounded by hills, a natural fortress. The news reached Thebes like a stormwind. Thutmose III, still young but forged by years under the shadow of Hatshepsut's reign, now stood as sole ruler of Egypt. His pride and ambition would not allow rebellion to go unpunished. He summoned his generals, priests, and scribes to the grand halls of Karnak, where walls glowed with torchlight and the scent of incense hung heavy. The decision was made. Egypt would march to Megiddo. The army assembled with precision unseen before. Soldiers from Nubia, archers from the Delta, charioteers gleaming in gold and bronze, all stood ready beneath banners bearing the falcon of Horus. The scribes recorded every detail. The number of men, the distance of each march, the offerings to Amun-Ra before the campaign. For this was not just a battle, it was to be written in history forever. The pharaoh himself rode in a chariot adorned with silver and electrum, drawn by horses whose bridles sparkled in the sun. The Nile's wind carried their prayers as drums thundered across the riverbanks. As they advanced into the lands of Canaan, the path split into three routes, one through Jephti, another through Tanach, and the most dangerous of all, the narrow pass of Aruna. The generals urged caution. "My pharaoh," they pleaded, "the Aruna road is too narrow. Two men cannot walk side by side. If the enemy waits there, the army will be trapped." But Thutmose's eyes, hard as obsidian, raised his hand. "They will expect us to take the safer roads. We will strike through Aruna, the path of gods and fools." His words were final. The decision would become one of the most daring military maneuvers in ancient history. The army moved in silence through the rugged cliffs of Aruna, each step echoing against the stone walls. Chariots were disassembled and dragged by hand. Men carried supplies on their backs under the relentless sun, with sweat and dust painting their faces like warriors of clay. Scouts returned with reports no enemy in sight. The gamble had worked. By nightfall, the Egyptian army emerged from the pass, their torches flickering like fireflies in the valley below. Megiddo, the Canaanite coalition, had been caught by surprise. Their forces were still scattered, unprepared for battle. At dawn, the horizon burned crimson. Thutmose stood on his chariot, gazing at the walled city of Megiddo in the distance, its gates glinting with bronze, its towers crowned with archers. The pharaoh raised his bow to the sky, calling upon Amun-Ra, the god of war and victory. "Bless this day," he shouted, "for it shall be remembered for eternity." Behind him, tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers formed their ranks, shields overlapping like scales, spears aimed forward. Trumpets roared, banners snapped in the wind, and the earth trembled as the chariots rolled into position. The first arrows flew, a storm of bronze-tipped death raining upon the defenders. Canaanite chariots charged down the slopes, their horses shrieking, wheels slicing through the dust. The clash was deafening, iron against bronze, flesh against stone. Egyptian archers unleashed volley after volley, cutting through enemy lines. The pharaoh's chariot sped forward, his whip cracking, his bow singing with divine precision. Every strike was measured, every command calculated. He was not merely fighting for victory, he was crafting immortality. The enemy line wavered. Panic spread among the Canaanite ranks as Egyptian infantry pushed deeper, their war cries echoing across the valley. The sun reached its peak, blazing down upon a field drenched in sweat and blood. Thutmose's forces surrounded the coalition's camp, cutting off their retreat. Those who tried to flee found the gates of Megiddo closed. Their own people had sealed them out in fear. The chaos turned to slaughter. Horses screamed, men fell, and banners of rebellion crumbled into the dust. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the battlefield fell silent except for the moans of the dying. Thutmose stood among his soldiers, his armor smeared with dust and victory. The city of Megiddo remained defiant, its walls unbroken, but its allies lay crushed. The pharaoh ordered his men to gather the spoils, chariots, weapons, and captured nobles. Yet even in triumph, he showed restraint. He commanded, "No man shall touch the city. We will take it not by destruction, but by hunger." Thus began the siege of Megiddo, a test not of might, but of endurance. Night fell upon the valley, torches flickering like stars across the Egyptian camp. Scribes etched the events of the day onto papyrus scrolls, recording every number, every offering, every act of courage. Thutmose retired to his tent, his face lit by the glow of a single lamp. He knew this battle would echo through ages yet unborn, that one day, men would read his deeds as the first chronicle of war. Outside, the drums of Egypt beat softly in the dark, a rhythm that spoke of destiny. And above them all, the city of Megiddo slept, wounded, cornered, waiting for dawn. The night that followed the first day of battle was one of tension and breathless waiting. The fires of the Egyptian camp glowed like a sea of stars across the valley floor, while the city of Megiddo loomed above them, its walls black silhouettes against a blood-red moon. The cries of the wounded faded into silence, replaced by the steady rhythm of hammers and chisels as Thutmose's engineers began to build siege works. The pharaoh himself did not sleep. Seated before a small brazier, the scent of myrrh rising into the cool desert air, he studied a map drawn on stretched papyrus. Every road, every hill, every possible escape route of the enemy was marked. "They will not outlast us," he said to his generals. "Megiddo will bow before the falcon of Horus." The morning came harsh and dry. The valley echoed with the sound of marching feet and creaking chariot wheels as the Egyptian army surrounded the city completely. They built a wall of encirclement, a barrier of sharpened stakes and trenches designed to starve Megiddo into submission. No food, no water, no messenger could enter or leave. It was the beginning of a slow, relentless siege. Inside the city, panic took root. The Canaanite lords who had fled there now found themselves trapped. Their pride turned to despair. Supplies dwindled, and the once defiant warriors of Kadesh now looked upon their leader with hollow eyes. For days that turned to weeks, the Egyptians maintained their vigil. Every morning, Thutmose would ride along the siege lines, his presence a symbol of divine endurance. He spoke to the soldiers, praised their courage, and reminded them that the gods favored those who endured. At night, the priests performed rituals under the open sky, offering sacrifices to Amun-Ra, Osiris, and Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war. The flames of their altars danced against the darkness, and the chants of the priests mingled with the sighing wind that swept down from the hills. Within Megiddo, famine tightened its grip. The people rationed grain and water, while disease spread through the crowded streets. Mothers wept for their children, and nobles cursed their fate. The king of Kadesh, once so proud, now sat in silence within his crumbling palace, watching his men turn weaker by the day. Each dawn brought the sight of Egyptian banners fluttering proudly beyond the walls, a constant reminder that no help was coming. But Thutmose was not without mercy. From time to time, he allowed captured messengers to return to the city with his words, promises that those who surrendered would be spared. "Lay down your arms," his decree said, "and the pharaoh shall grant you life under his protection." Some inside the city began to whisper that perhaps surrender was the will of the gods. Others, bound by pride and fear, refused. Still, the walls of Megiddo stood tall, scarred but unbroken. The days bled into months. The Egyptian camps had become small cities of their own, tents aligned in perfect order, markets forming among soldiers, blacksmiths hammering new weapons under the sun. Thutmose's scribes continued their work faithfully, documenting each passing day, the rations consumed, the offerings made, the omens observed. One night, as the pharaoh looked toward the city, lightning split the sky, illuminating the massive gates of Megiddo. The priests interpreted it as a sign. The gods had decided that time had come. The next morning, Egyptian horns blared, drums thundered. The siege was tightening. Thutmose ordered his men to advance the fortifications closer, erecting towers and ramps to overlook the enemy's defenses. Archers climbed these wooden structures and unleashed volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. The defenders tried to respond with stones and fire, but their strength was waning. For the first time, the gates of Megiddo trembled under the weight of Egyptian siege engines. The sound of wood splintering echoed across the valley like thunder. Yet, even as victory drew near, the pharaoh remained patient. "A city taken by fire yields only ashes," he told his generals. "A city that surrenders gives tribute forever." His strategy was not merely to conquer but to dominate through awe, to make Megiddo a living symbol of Egypt's unbreakable power. So he waited, confident that time itself would crush his enemies. As the moon rose once more, a change came over the city. The torches that usually burned along its walls were dimmed. No arrows flew, no shouts came from the ramparts. The silence was unsettling. Egyptian scouts crept forward, their footsteps light as whispers. What they saw made them hurry back to camp. Ropes dangled down the city walls, and shadows slipped into the darkness. The enemy was fleeing. Thutmose was awakened at once. "They are escaping," a guard cried. The pharaoh rose, his eyes flashing with a fire of purpose. "Seal every road," he commanded. "No man leaves Megiddo alive without my word." The Egyptian chariots thundered into motion, wheels cutting through the night as they raced to block the fleeing rebels. Arrows rained upon the roads, and chaos consumed the darkness. When dawn broke, hundreds of Canaanite soldiers lay scattered across the fields, their weapons cast aside, their courage spent. By midday, the last of the resistance had crumbled. The gates of Megiddo, once symbols of defiance, swung open under Egyptian guard. The city that had dared to challenge the might of the pharaoh was now silent, broken, and humbled. From within its walls emerged the defeated kings, their robes torn, their crowns replaced with ropes around their necks, not as slaves, but as supplicants. They knelt before Thutmose III, their faces pressed to the dust. "We are your servants," they said. "Spare us, O Pharaoh, shadow of the sun." Thutmose stood upon his chariot, sunlight blazing on his armor. He looked down at them, enemies once proud, now trembling before his power. The priests proclaimed his victory as divine, the favor of Amen manifest upon earth. But the Pharaoh lifted his hand for silence. "You shall live," he said, "not as kings, but as guardians of Egypt's peace." With those words, the rebellion was ended, and mercy, not vengeance, sealed his triumph. That night, the valley of Megiddo was alive with celebration. Fires blazed high, drums beat in rhythm with the heart of a victorious empire, and chants rose into the heavens. The spoils of war were countless chariots of gold, bronze shields, and prisoners of noble blood. Yet what Thutmose valued most was not the treasure, but the message carved into eternity that Egypt's power was ordained by the gods themselves. And as the Pharaoh looked toward the horizon where the sun sank behind the hills, he knew the world had changed. The rebellion had been crushed, his name immortalized, and the first true chronicle of war written for the ages. But deep within the city's ruins, the embers of resistance smoldered, still faint, but alive. The story of Megiddo was not yet done. The dawn that followed Megiddo's surrender rose quietly, its first light glinting off Egyptian banners that fluttered across the valley like golden wings. Smoke curled from the city's gates, not from destruction, but from the incense of peace offerings. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and victory. Pharaoh Thutmose III stood atop the walls of Megiddo, gazing out at the land he had reclaimed. Below him, the Egyptian army moved in disciplined harmony, gathering spoils, recording the names of captured kings, and restoring order to the conquered city. The rebellion that had once threatened Egypt's northern dominion was now nothing more than a story written in the dust of defeat. Inside the pharaoh's pavilion, scribes worked tirelessly, their reed pens scratching against papyrus as they documented every detail of the campaign. They recorded the numbers of horses captured, the treasures taken, the names of the defeated rulers, and the offerings made to the gods. These records, written in the elegant hieroglyphs of the temple script, would one day be engraved upon the walls of Karnak, the first true account of war in human history. The pharaoh's triumph was not just a victory of arms, but of legacy. Thutmose understood that memory, not metal, was the foundation of empire. Megiddo itself was spared the wrath that had consumed other rebel cities. Thutmose decreed that its people would live, its walls would stand, and its fields would once again bear crops, but under Egyptian rule. He knew that a city preserved was worth more than a city burned. The defeated kings were brought before him once more, now clothed in humility rather than armor. They carried tribute, gold vessels, lapis lazuli, ivory, and rare woods from distant lands. Each gift was an oath of loyalty renewed, each bow a silent promise that Egypt's will would never again be defied. Thutmose accepted their offerings with calm grace. He spoke to them not as a conqueror but as a god among men. "You have seen the might of Egypt," he said. "Now you shall see its mercy. Serve faithfully, and the son of Ammon will shine upon you once more." His voice carried the weight of prophecy, and the assembled kings bowed until their foreheads touched the ground. The priests who stood beside him proclaimed that Amun-Ra himself had guided the pharaoh's chariot, that divine favor had delivered this victory. The soldiers echoed the chant, their voices rising in thunderous unison. "The pharaoh is the son of Ammon, the falcon of Horus reigns forever." In the days that followed, the city was cleansed of battles, scars, wells were reopened, temples repaired, and the people returned to their homes beneath the watchful gaze of Egyptian overseers. Columns of soldiers carried treasures southward, their long lines stretching across the horizon. The spoils of Megiddo were vast, over 2,000 horses, hundreds of chariots, gold, silver, and exotic goods from the lands beyond the Euphrates. Yet what Thutmose carried home, above all, was glory, the kind that would echo in stone and scripture long after his death. When the army reached Thebes, the city erupted in jubilation. Trumpets blared from temple towers, dancers filled the streets, and priests burned incense in the name of victory. The pharaoh entered the temple of Ammon at Karnak, his armor gleaming like the sun, his steps slow and measured as drums pounded in rhythm to his heartbeat. Before the towering statue of Ammon, he knelt and offered the spoils of war, gold from Canaanite, captives from the hills, and weapons taken from the rebels. "By your will I have conquered," he said. "By your strength I have ruled." The high priests anointed him with sacred oils, and the people hailed him as the living embodiment of divine power. In the years that followed, the story of the Battle of Megiddo became legend. Artists painted it upon temple walls, their pigments bright as blood and fire. Carvings depicted the pharaoh leading his chariots through the narrow pass of Aruna, the enemy scattered before him like reeds in the wind. The scribes preserved every word of the campaign on scrolls that would outlast dynasties. For the first time in history, a battle was not merely fought, it was recorded, immortalized, and remembered as the moment humanity first gave voice to war. But victory brought with it reflection. In the stillness of night, when the palace was silent and only the torches flickered, Thutmose often walked the temple corridors alone. He would pause before the reliefs depicting his triumph and wonder about the men who had fallen, both Egyptian and Canaanite. The sands of Megiddo had drunk deeply of life's blood, And though glory now filled the halls of Thebes, the memory of the slain lingered like a whisper on the wind. Perhaps the gods demanded such a price for immortality. As the years passed, Egypt's influence spread farther than ever before. Thutmose led more campaigns, conquered more lands, and gathered tributes from kingdoms that had once defied him. His empire stretched from the banks of the Nile to the great rivers of Mesopotamia. Yet, no matter how many victories followed, none would ever surpass Megiddo, the battle that had crowned him not only as ruler of men, but as the first strategist of written history. When Thutmose grew old and his hair turned silver beneath the crown, he would often speak of that fateful day in 1457 BC. At Megiddo, he told his scribes, "We learn that courage is the truest offering to the gods," and so he commanded that his deeds be carved upon the walls of Ammon's temple, to be read by future generations long after his name had faded from mortal tongues. Those carvings remain to this day silent witnesses of a time when history itself took its first breath through the voice of Egypt. As the sun set upon his reign, the valley of Megiddo once again grew quiet. Grass sprouted over the bones of warriors, and the wind whispered through the ruins where kings had once fallen. But though the city aged and empires rose and fell, the story of that first great battle endured. Scholars would one day call it the dawn of recorded warfare, the moment humanity began to chronicle its endless struggle for power. And so ends the tale of the Battle of Megiddo, the first recorded battle in human history, a story not of destruction alone, but of vision, legacy, and the birth of remembrance. For as long as men tell stories of war and glory, the name of Thutmose III and the Valley of Megiddo will live on, carved in stone, written in time, and carried forever on the winds of eternity.